This video will cover the U.S. Customs and Border Protection. Now, I do want to highlight before I start the video that I personally am not a supporter of federal immigration enforcement agencies like ICE and the CBP. However, because I study law enforcement and this is the Law Enforcement Agency Information Channel, I will still be covering it. But yeah, I'm Nicholas, and you're watching the Law Enforcement Agency Information Channel. The U.S. Customs and Border Protection, or CBP for short, is a civilian staffed, full service, uniformed United States federal law enforcement agency that falls under the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, or DHS for short, which falls under, or which is a part of the greater executive branch of the U.S. federal government. The CBP is by far the largest federal law enforcement agency in the U.S., with over 60,000 employees, of course, the vast majority of which being sworn LEOs or sworn law enforcement officers. But the CBP, they are primarily responsible for facilitating and controlling the flow of immigration and commerce both into and out of the U.S. through the enforcement of federal immigration and customs laws and any active federal tariffs. They basically they cover each port of entry. They have a field division for each port of entry, or not a. I wouldn't say they have a field division for each port of entry, but more so they cover each port of entry. The CBP in general, they cover all types of port of entries, air, land, and sea. So this would include airports, seaports, land borders, and pretty much any port of entry out there within the U.S. Or its territories. But some specific duties of the U.S. Customs and Border Protection would include protecting and managing immigration through U.S. and international ports of entry, finding and seizing illegal drugs and other forms of contraband that have or are being smuggled into the U.S. They are responsible for both those smuggled into the U.S. and those actively being smuggled into the U.S. So, and then of course also finding and putting a stop to organizations that use U.S. and international ports of entry as a way to smuggle people and goods illegally. Working with fellow law enforcement agencies, where specifically when they have concurrent jurisdiction or shared responsibilities, such as, for example, the CBP and ICE will very often work with each other when in cases where, let's say, an immigrant has fled the border. ICE and the CBP will very often have overlapping jurisdiction on that, unless in the case that it is outside the 100-mile zone, then the CBP most likely will not get involved, but I'll get into that later. But yeah, they also work with the DEA, FBI. I'll get into their collaboration later. But some other duties would include finding and arresting individuals who have illegally entered the U.S. illegally. Pretty much those are their main responsibilities and duties. But again, you can get more specific, and there could be other duties too. That's pretty much it for their main responsibilities. Now, there are some important things to note that I want to highlight before I get into the rest of the video. And by the way, ignore the stuff behind me. I'm in my younger brother's bedroom. But the first thing to note, despite what everybody says, is that Border Patrol is it's not a agency. It's not a federal law enforcement agency. While it is federal law enforcement, it's not a federal law enforcement agency in and of itself, but rather a federal law enforcement division. You see, Border Patrol, it's a division of the U.S. Customs and Border Protection, which is a federal law enforcement agency. But Border Patrol itself, it's not an actual agency, but rather a division of a federal law enforcement agency, if that makes sense. So, in other words, if you were to list out all federal law enforcement agencies, the Border Patrol wouldn't be on that list. It would be the broader U.S. Customs and Border Protection. The same goes with the Office of Field Operations. They are not a federal law enforcement agency. They are a federal law enforcement division. They are a division of the broader federal law enforcement agency, the U.S. Customs and Border Protection. And, same goes with the Office of Air and Marine Operations. I think you get what I really mean by now. But the other important thing I want to note is that despite the fact they even use the term on their website, it is informal to refer to a sworn officer from the CBP Office of Field Operations as just a CBP officer. You see, the term CBP officer, it's very broad. Someone can easily mistake it with referring to any officer of the CBP. If you're explicitly referring to a officer from the CBP Office of Field Operations, you should say a CBP Field Operations Officer, or more simply, a CBP Field Officer, because again, CBP officer, that's very, very broad. That can just refer to a Border Patrol agent, any real officer of the CBP. But those are the two main things I wanted to highlight. So, yeah.
Voy a abrir ventanas. No. Usted me lo quiebra, usted me lo paga. Usted me lo quiebra, usted me lo paga. Usted quiebra mi ventana. ¿Por qué hizo eso, señor? ¿Pero por qué lo están haciendo? Lo que quedó de mi pobre carro. Ay, hombre. Esos majes, la segunda, 2 veces en 10 minutos me pararon. Entrando al restaurante y cuando vengo con la comida la segunda vez. Los segundos no tuvieron benevolencia de una. No tengo aquí, uy, me dobló la nuca bien feo de maje, porque me agarró aquí, mira.
Watching this video, if I'm going to be honest, does not really surprise me, as there have been there have been much worse operations and incidents involving the CBP and ICE throughout the past. But with that being said, it is still wrong what they did. In terms of operational standards, I can really see. I mean, in terms of operational standards, there are multiple flaws. The 3 main problems with their operation, with the agents carrying out the operation, was, number 1, efficiency. They basically based the operation was factless. It was based off of profiling tactics, most likely, considering the individual involved was a U.S. citizen. He was a citizen in America who was born in Honduras, but he was a U.S. citizen. So what I'm guessing is that they had no real proof or factual base that that he was in here illegally, because obviously he wasn't. He had U.S. citizenship. So basically, what they were doing was they most likely just based this off of stereotypes. I mean, yeah, I mean, which makes it most even more unclear why they are using such a high degree of use of force, if they're just basing this off of profiling tactics. Because I mean, it doesn't really make sense why they would actually use such a high degree of use of force when they don't actually have any facts that he's here illegally, just their profiling tactics. It's kind of wrong in that sense. While and of course, profiling just in general, it's wrong. It's ethically incorrect. However, they are technically allowed to do it, legally speaking, as court cases have highlighted throughout the past. While it is again ethically incorrect, they are still allowed to do it by law. But the other problem with the operation was their, again, use of force. They used extreme use of force. They broke his window, and as seen in the video, he had scratch marks all over his right and left arm because of the agents. They threw him on the ground, and all of this just for someone who was unarmed. I mean, that doesn't really make sense. I mean, again, they didn't even contact local law enforcement before doing this. That's also another problem. But yeah, I mean, it's just a very high degree and unnecessary use of force. And then the third problem was that basically, trying to think, what was it? I mean, sorry. The third problem was that it was their responsibility. Basically, this operation was conducted by Border Patrol agents. This was in Charlotte. This video took place in Charlotte. Charlotte is not within 100 miles of any U.S. land border, which makes me wonder why they are even there. Why they are even carrying out these operations. And it's even more confusing because they're not just carrying out like regular immigration operations. They are carrying out immigration operations based on profiling tactics, not based on any factual basis. So that's even more confusing. And then added on top of that, the use of force they used, it's real irresponsible and just unnecessary. Again, this was really it was outside their main responsibilities. This should have been ICE that was conducting these operations, not the CBP. They really did not. It's not clear to me why they actually even carried out that operation. Again, they only would have carried out that operation if realistically it was in 100 miles of a U.S. land border, or the suspect had committed a crime against Border Patrol. But in this case, they didn't. So I don't know why the Border Patrol agents are even approaching, or contacting that guy. So I think that's the real main three problems with the incident. The U.S. Customs Service, which was essentially the CBP's ancestor agency, or oldest ancestor agency, was established on 1789 by Congress to basically collect import taxes among immigrating individuals and goods. These taxes were proved essential at the time, considering this was only a few years after the American Revolutionary War. They helped the U.S. develop. They helped the federal government develop the U.S. Not only for paying federal employees, but again also developing the U.S. They helped the federal government pay for things like nowadays. Like pay for things like territories, for example, that are nowadays U.S. states, like purchasing Florida from Spain. They helped a lot at the time, as they were one of the main sources of income, or the main sources of getting income for the federal government. In 1969, the U.S. Border Control was renamed by President Nixon to the U.S. Border Patrol. And then later on, in March 3rd of 2001, shortly after the September 11th attacks and major Homeland Security reorganization, the U.S. Customs and Border Protection was established under the newly formed U.S. Department of Homeland Security. Additionally, the same bill that ordered the establishment of the CBP also ordered that the U.S. Immigration and Naturalization Service and the U.S. Customs Service be disbanded, and that their duties and former employees would be basically transferred to the authority of the CBP, or U.S. Customs and Border Protection, and the U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE. Additionally, the Immigration and Naturalization Service, some of its duties was also transferred to the authority of the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, particularly its naturalization duties. Nowadays, the USCIS is responsible for naturalization and granting U.S. citizenship. So that was some of the duties it was transferred or got. But the CBP, in terms of the CBP, they received the U.S. Customs Services and the U.S. Immigration and Naturalization Services uniform duties. So this would include, Border Patrol, protecting ports of entry. These are uniformed duties that they received. And then ICE, they received the investigative duties of and the direct enforcement duties, like collecting or basically getting immigrants, finding and arresting immigrants. That was one of the duties ICE received. But additionally, the bill also ordered that APHIS, specifically the Plant Protection Quarantine Inspectors from APHIS, or the Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service, would be transferred to the authority of the U.S. Customs and Border Protection, or CBP. So, but it's important to note that only the plant protection quarantine inspectors of APHIS were transferred to the CBP, not the entire APHIS, just its plant protection quarantine inspectors. But yeah, and then later on, in around 2006, the U.S. Around 2006, the U.S. Customs and Border Protection, the U.S. Customs and Border Protection Office of Air and Marine Operations was established, basically to as a division to handle both air and marine duties. That basically, before that, other divisions like Border Patrol were handling air and marine duties. But now that the Office of Air and Marine Operations was established, they basically took those duties. But and then later on, something similar happened in 2007. The Border Patrol Special Operations Group was established as a way to bring BORTAC, or the Border Patrol tactical, Border Patrol tactical, the Border Patrol tactical, uh, I forgot what it's called, BORTAC and BORSTAR. They were basically merged to make the Border Patrol Special Operations Group. And basically, this was a way to improve, collaboration and, just make a group. Because before that, they were just independent units of the U.S. Customs and Border Protection. They weren't overseen by any division. That is really why, as a way to improve their operations, they were put in under a oversight of division, the Special Operations Group, which they remain in today. And then probably one of the most disastrous and chaotic moments in the CBP's history, specifically and especially for Border Patrol, was the Del Rico incident, which was basically an incident that occurred on September of 2021 in Del Rico, Texas. Essentially, a group of U.S. Border Patrol agents on horseback came into Del Rico and began basically chasing, confronting, and whipping Haitian migrants all the way to the international bridge in Del Rico. It was very chaotic. It received, after the incident, the Border Patrol and the CBP in general received massive reactions from the public. They essentially, the agents involved were eventually put in under investigation by the Department of Homeland Security, Office of Inspector General, who then eventually determined that they would be put in under administrative duty or administrative leave. That's pretty much it for the history of the CBP. The Tariff Act is the primary federal law regulating foreign trade and commerce through the implementation of tariffs. The CBP's role, as highlighted in Section 592 of the Tariff Act, is to enforce those tariffs. Now, it's specifically the Tariff Act of 1930, again, the main or last adjusted Tariff Act. The CBP, it issues both, again, as highlighted in Section 592 of the Tariff Act, it issues both civil and criminal penalties for violations of the Tariff Act, including gross negligence, and fraud. The CBP, it's important to note that it controls, it has authority over both inbound shipments, to the U.S. and outbound shipments from the U.S. It has control over both of those. It utilizes both the automated export system. Essentially, all shipments, all exports from the U.S. that go through the automated export system are required to basically submit their export information data to the U.S. Commerce Control List or the U.S. Munitions List, depending on what's being transported or exported. There are two main devices that they use. They use the automated export system and the automated targeting system. Now, these two devices, they are meant basically to find threats, things that may threaten Homeland Security or individuals that do not have, or to find individuals that basically have invalid immigration status. Again, they work with both they basically they give the data collected on the data collected on on exports are basically given to both the U.S. Bureau of the Census and the U.S. Department of State Directorate of Defense Trade Controls. It coordinates the data to both of them. But the CBP it also works frequently with the departments of defense and state, basically to improve standards for standards on military commodities, for both imports and exports of military commodities. They work with the Department of Defense and Department of State to improve those standards and to make their export enforcement system much more efficient. But I know what you're thinking. Why would the CBP even enforce tariffs if it falls under the Department of Homeland Security? Well, it's because essentially the Tariff Act, which gives the CBP authority to enforce tariffs, was made and last adjusted in the 1900s, around 1930. And during that time, there was no the CBP. It wasn't the CBP as we know it today. The CBP as we know it today was formally established in 2001. In March of 2001, under the Department of Homeland Security. The CBP back then was known as the CBP's predecessor was known as the U.S. Customs Service, and it fell under the Department of the Treasury. So essentially, the Tariff Act was formed at the time that customs enforcement was handled by the Department of the Treasury, which makes sense why they gave it back then the authority to enforce tariffs, because obviously tariffs enforcement would be something within the Treasury's focus, the Treasury's department's focus. But they haven't really changed it ever since. Which makes sense. Again, some things just never are never really changed. But yeah, I mean, again, so that's really the reason why. It's the same concept as how, why does the Secret Service why does the Secret Service investigate credit card fraud if it falls under the Department of Homeland Security? It's the same idea. The main law allowing it to do so was last adjusted in the 1900s, when the Secret Service did not fall under the Department of Homeland Security, but rather the Department of the Treasury. So, again, some things just never really change. But yeah, that's primarily it for the CBP's main duties when it comes to the enforcement of federal, tariffs and shipment laws. CBP officers have authority to carry firearms, issue warrantless arrests, and carry out warrants both on duty and off duty throughout their respective jurisdiction. Speaking of which, the CBP has overall domestic-wide jurisdiction throughout the United States and its individual territories to enforce federal immigration, customs, trade, and tariff-related laws. Now, with that being said, it maintains primary jurisdiction basically within a 100-mile radius inbound of any U.S. land border and at any U.S. port of entry. Let me rephrase. I meant they have primary jurisdiction. They have primary jurisdiction at any U.S. port of entry and within a 100-mile radius inbound of any U.S. land border. Just not to mistake the 100-mile zone for having any, for including any port of entry other than land borders. So yeah, essentially the key part there is obviously they have primary jurisdiction over ports of entry, but the thing is the part where it gets more unique is their primary jurisdiction over a 100-mile radius inbound of any U.S. land border. The interesting part about there is they have expanded authority within that 100. It's very commonly known as a 100-mile zone. They have expanded authority within that 100-mile zone of any U.S. land border to issue warrantless searches and seizures. And now this 100-mile zone, their powers within this 100-mile zone are known as exempt from the Constitution, and as Supreme Court orders have highlighted numerous times in the past, the CBP can issue warrantless searches and seizures for probable cause, of course, as long as they are within that 100-mile zone of any U.S. land border. And notice how I highlighted land border. I don't just mean any port of entry. I'm explicitly referring to a land border. Their authority within that, the overall the 100-mile zone, it's very broad. It covers around 66.7% of the U.S. population, so it is very broad. However, again, outside that 100-mile zone, they do not have the authority to issue warrantless searches and seizures, only within that 100-mile zone. Now, with that being said, while the CBP does have overall nationwide jurisdiction and is not limited to, U.S. land borders and the 100-mile zone, they do primarily stick to the 100-mile zone, as that is basically where they maintain primary responsibility. So like outside the 100-mile zone, for example, if they're chasing a suspect, a immigrant who has fled the border, and that suspect goes outside 100 miles of the border that it fled from, it then at that point, it doesn't really become the CBP's responsibility to pursue it. It's rather within the responsibility of ICE, not the CBP, because again, the CBP's role, it's not to find and arrest immigrants even those who have fled the border. It's really to find its role is basically to protect U.S. ports of entry and to enforce immigration laws at U.S. ports of entry. The ones actually finding and arresting illegal immigrants who made it past U.S. ports of entries and borders, that's the responsibility of ICE special agents, not CBP. And I think the CBP forgets that very often because it can be seen conducting operations in Charlotte, Boston. Again, these operations should rather be handled by ICE, not the CBP, because it's not within their primary jurisdiction, but again, primary jurisdiction also means primary responsibility. They don't really have responsibility over, individuals who flee the U.S. border or any port of entry beyond a 100-mile zone. So it's not really clear why they would be even really operating in cities that aren't within a 100-mile zone and arresting individuals, which was very unclear, as you saw, which is why it was very confusing in the video that I showed you guys earlier. Where the CBP agents, specifically Border Patrol agents, were just, they were trying to arrest that individual in the Ford pickup truck. That was in Charlotte. Charlotte's not within the 100-mile zone, and it's especially confusing why they're even, there conducting just, regular immigration enforcement operations. That should be rather handled by ICE, not the CBP. The only cases where the CBP would really need to pursue these individuals is if they basically committed a crime against a CBP officer, explicitly against the CBP officer, or basically, or if they, that's really the only case, unless they're a threat to homeland security and they're in the middle of an entire task force. Like, for example, if it's terrorists, of course, that's an exemption. But just regular individuals who flee the border, that's not within their primary responsibility. That's within the primary responsibility of ICE. But the CBP, it derives its jurisdiction and authority primarily from the Immigration and Nationality Act. However, it also derives some of its jurisdiction and authority, specifically its powers and obligations from the Tariff Act of 1930. So yeah, that's primarily it for their jurisdiction and authority. Training for the CBP is hard and varies by division and position. U.S. Border Patrol agents, they undergo approximately 19 to 20 weeks of training at the U.S. Border Patrol Academy, which is a part of the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center in Artesia, New Mexico. During their training, they undergo courses covering a variety of courses, including those covering firearm tactics, physical tactics, fugitive apprehension tactics, emergency vehicle tactics, generic investigative tactics, how to properly use agency equipment, such as UAVs, etc. And then, of course, also courses covering criminal law, so specifically criminal, civil, and immigration law. They undergo criminal, civil, and immigration and customs laws. Again, the main laws they would enforce. They undergo courses covering those, so that way they know the laws that they are going to enforce on field. But additionally, CBP Border Patrol agents, they also undergo courses. They also undergo Spanish training courses. However, with that being said, not all Border Patrol recruits are required to go through Spanish training courses. Specifically, Border Patrol recruits who are already fluent at Spanish. If you're already fluent, if you're a Border Patrol recruit and you're already fluent in Spanish and you can prove that to Border Patrol instructors, then you won't have to go through any Spanish training courses. But if you are not really fluent in Spanish, you will have to go through approximately 5 weeks of Spanish training courses. Now, it's important to note that this is only for getting into Border Patrol. Once you go through Border Patrol, once you accomplish and complete Border Patrol Academy, you are actually prone to go through additional weeks of on-the-job training. As again, the training that you undergo at the Border Patrol Academy, it doesn't cover Border Patrol specific tactics. And I know despite the fact it's called Border Patrol Academy, it doesn't really cover as many specific tactics as the tactics used by Border Patrol. So at the actual during on the job training, they will train you on more specific tactics, like more Border Patrol specific tactics, like how to operate checkpoints. How to conduct search and seizures, on individuals, and other Border Patrol specific tactics. The Border Patrol Academy, though, it is widely accepted as one of the most rigorous federal law enforcement academies out there. Much more rigorous than the training FBI agents go through, at least in terms of physical training, and especially more rigorous. Then training Border Patrol Academy is much more rigorous in terms of fitness, in terms of physical requirements, compared to training that NCIS agents go through, FBI agents go through, ATF agents go through. Again, it is Border Patrol Academy. It's considered one of the hardest federal law enforcement academies out there. But yeah, that's really it for training for Border Patrol. CBP field operations officers, agricultural specialists, and import specialists undergo approximately 14 to 15 weeks of training at the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center in Glencoe, Georgia. During their training, they undergo a variety of courses, including those covering firearm tactics, physical tactics, fugitive apprehension tactics, vehicle tactics, how to properly use agency equipment, immigration, customs, and trade and agricultural law, those are the main courses that they undergo. Additionally, this only covers on-the-job training. This only covers the training to get into the agency. And once you get into the agency, again, like Border Patrol, you will also undergo on-the-job training, which may last between 3 to 21 weeks. And I know it's a lot, but at least their initial training phase, or the training phase that you have to you have to undergo in order to get into the agency, at least that is less than Border Patrol, because again, also the tactics covered by the entire training course the entire training courses Border Patrol agents go through is much harder than those that field operations officers go through. So yeah, that's pretty much it for training when it comes to the CBP Office of Field Operations. CBP Air and Marine Operations officers undergo approximately 15 weeks of training at the Air and Marine Operations Academy, the CBP Air and Marine Operations Academy, which is located at the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center in Glencoe, Georgia. Additionally, they will also undergo, first, the tactics covered in the Air and Marine Operations Academy. Those are the same as the tactics we've covered earlier within, tactics covered by Border Patrol and Office of Field Operations. Again, pretty similar tactics, basically the same. Because again, they're all federal law enforcement officers of the CBP, so most of their tactics that they will cover are going to be the same. But when tactics begin to vary is when it comes to on-the-job training. On-the-job training, Office of Air and Marine Operations officers, they also undergo on-the-job training after they join the agency and finish the Air and Marine Operations Academy at FLETC. They undergo on-the-job training, which will have courses covering parachuting, parachuting, fast roping. Again, a lot of cool stuff. But I mean, it's also swimming, diving, again, pretty much any tactics that you will need for air and marine operations. It's not as it's not as intensive as the Navy SEALs. It's completely separate from training the Navy SEALs go through. But what I'm saying is, think about the training Navy SEALs go through. It's very similar in that concept. Of course, not nearly close as hard. Trust me, it's not nearly as close to as hard as the training they go through, but it is the same kind of concept, because the operations Navy SEALs go through is both air and marine, and the operations they go through, the air and marine operations officers from the CBP, is also air and marine. So that should be a helpful concept to review. So that's pretty much it for training for the Air and Marine Office of Air and Marine Operations of the CBP. CBP OPR, criminal investigators, also known as special agents, undergo a total of approximately 17 weeks of training. The specific location varies as there is basically two sections of their training. The first section takes approximately 11 weeks and is taking place at the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center in Glencoe, Georgia. Now, their training during this first section is specifically at the Criminal Investigators Training Program, or is led by the Criminal Investigators Training Program, which is a component of the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center in Glencoe, Georgia. And basically, the program handles, general federal law enforcement investigative tactics. So basically, those that you will see covered by, for example, NCIS agents, they undergo the Criminal Investigators Training Program. So that it the tactics that they will cover is mainly investigative, but also it also involves general law enforcement tactics like fugitive apprehension tactics, physical tactics, emergency vehicle tactics, firearm tactics. But then it also gets into the more agency, but it also gets into the more investigative tactics. So things like pretty much any investigative tactics. But then the other section, section 2, that takes place at the CBP Advanced Training Center in Harpers Ferry, West Virginia, and it takes approximately 6 weeks. That is more agency specific. They will cover more, they will cover, they will have courses covering things like, that are more related to professional responsibility and, things like integrity, the agency's motto, mission statements, and how you should uphold them. Again, things like that, and how you should handle audits, investigations into corruption within the agency. Much more agency specific. They will not really cover that at the Criminal Investigators Training Program because it is not led by the CBP, but FLETC. And FLETC is more of a group program, so it's a program, it's not agency specific. It's not specific to the CBP. It's specific to federal law enforcement in general. The Advanced Training Center, that's much more specific to the CBP and is led by the CBP and is located, like I said, in Harpers Ferry, West Virginia. The basic requirements to joining the CBP for any position are that number one, you must be a U.S. citizen, obviously, and you must have lived in the U.S. for at least 3 years. Number two, you must have a active state-issued driver's license. Number three, you must have a bachelor's degree from an accredited college or university, or general education's diploma, and experience in a professional position like law enforcement. So if you were, like, for example, if you were in the past a state trooper, and in addition to that had a general education's diploma, which obviously you would have because it's a requirement to becoming a state trooper in most states or in all states, then that would be considered, that would fit the requirements for education for joining the CBP, because being a state trooper is considered a professional professional role, and it is considered obviously within the general field of law enforcement that it's important to note that you do not need to be a past law enforcement officer in order to join the CBP. This is only for people who don't have a degree and just want to, get in. If you do not have a degree and you want to get into the CBP, you just have to have some past law enforcement experience, either at a local police department or whatever, or a state police department, whatever. Additionally, another requirement is that you must be eligible and willing to carry and use a firearm nationwide. Additionally, while not explicitly a requirement, you should not have any past criminal records. As while it is not explicitly a requirement, they will, of course, conduct a background check on you. Additionally, there may be other requirements depending on the position. So, for example, if you are a criminal applying to become a criminal investigator, they are more than likely to only choose those who or might have requirements that specify that you must have a bachelor's degree. In fact, I bet so. These requirements that I listed before were just the requirements to becoming a CBP officer, the basic requirements. So if you're planning to become a Border Patrol agent and you fit all those requirements I listed earlier, then you should be good. But other than that, if you are becoming trying to become like a join a more like like a different position within this CBP, like a criminal investigator or analyst, the requirements may vary. So I'd check the CBP's website and usajobs.gov for more details on that. But yeah, that's pretty much it for their training and requirements. The CBP, as it does fall under the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, reports to the Secretary of Homeland Security, which is the head of the Department of Homeland Security. And as the Department of Homeland Security does fall under the executive branch of the U.S. federal government, its head, the Secretary of Homeland Security, furthermore reports to the head of the executive branch of the U.S. federal government, which is the President of the United States. The rank structure of the CBP from high to low is in the following order: Commissioner, Deputy Commissioner, Chief of Staff, Executive Assistant Commissioner, Assistant Commissioner, Executive Director, Chief Operating Officer, Chief Financial Officer, Chief Counsel, Deputy Executive Assistant Commissioner, Director, First Assistant Director, Second Assistant Director, Chief, Supervisory Officer, Senior Officer, Officer. the CBP has received multiple, and I mean multiple, criticizations from the past and to the present day. Some of these main and most common criticizations include number one, the CBP's deportation exercises and its insufficient jailing system. The CBP is very commonly criticized for start with deportation exercises. It is known for separating families at borders, separating parents from kids and that all. Specifically, Border Patrol, the Border Patrol division of the CBP, they are very commonly criticized for that. They will, and this is linking to the insufficient jailing system. They will very often, once they've captured and arrested, for example, a family of illegal immigrants at a border, what they'll very often do is they'll send them to a CBP detention facility, and these facilities, there's many problems to them. Number one, just to make it clear, these facilities are short lasting. They are not meant to hold immigrants for more than a few days, at a week at the most. They're commonly criticized, these detention facilities, for essentially. They're criticized for basically violating human rights, or for human rights violations. Like, for example, they are known to have a history of, abuses and essentially, neglect. They will very often fail to feed. Not very often, but they've been known to neglect certain inmates at those detention facilities, and for that reason, they are very commonly criticized. They've also been criticized for violating health codes and federal health laws, for which has, I believe, led to a few investigations and audits by the Department of Homeland Security, but they. What the real problem or criticization, the real problem, and what the CBP is commonly criticized for is that when it comes to its deportation exercises, that once and for its jailing system, is that once the like I was talking about earlier, once the family of illegal immigrants are put in the CBP detention facility and have stayed there for a number of days, and the CBP is ready to transfer them to ICE's custody, they'll essentially, the real problem here is that they're not always good at sending people with their family. So, for example, they might send one of the family's kids to an ICE detention facility in Arizona, while they might send his parents to a detention facility in California. So it's very commonly criticized for that reason. That's really, that's a very, very, very big criticization of the CBP. The difference between CBP and ICE detention facilities are that, like I believe I said earlier, is that the CBP detention facilities, they're short-lasting. The ICE detention facilities, they're more long-lasting. They keep immigrants for as long as they need to. The CBP, it only keeps immigrants within those detention facilities for a few days or a week at the most. Also, ICE detention facilities, again, that's very, very, very broader. ICE has numerous more detention facilities than the CBP. Although their facilities, they're not that far off from the CBP. They're very similar, actually. A lot of things what ICE does is very similar to the CBP. Their detention facilities, not that far off. They're not that great in general. They have very bad, or not very bad, but they have bad sanitation and stuff. But but the main difference is that, again, there are many more ICE detention facilities, and ICE detention facilities, they hold much more immigrants. Not only just immigrants who fled the border, but immigrants across the U.S. The CBP, it really only holds immigrants that have fled the border directly, while directly being witnessed by Border Patrol or any other CBP officer. They're very commonly criticized for that. But another thing that they are very commonly criticized for is essentially is racial profiling. The CBP is very commonly criticized for essentially profiling suspects by their ethnicity or race, or basically, very often they'll be criticized of racial profiling when they do things like random arrests, when they do like specific selective arrests, like they'll find people on the street and say, hey, this guy doesn't look like an U.S. citizen, so let's arrest him. That is what they are very often criticized for. As seen in that video over there, that meant the video that I showed earlier, that was essentially racial profiling, because they had no evidence that he was here legally, and obviously he was not here illegally. He had U.S. citizenship, so what they were doing there was racial profiling, and that is a great example of one of the CBP's criticizations. But another key criticization of the CBP is, let me think. Pursuits. The CBP Border Patrol in particular gets into numerous pursuits each year. These pursuits can turn deadly very easily. Border Patrol very often gets into these pursuits after basically immigrants have fled the border. They'll get into very, very fast pursuits. These pursuits, they're very deadly. They have, like I showed earlier, the statistics, they have led to multiple deaths and casualties. I believe in around 2021 or 2022, approximately 23 people died from Border Patrol pursuits, and that's a lot. That's a lot. Okay, it's not good. That is what the CBP is very commonly criticized for. Its executives, the people who lead the CBP, they're very often criticized for not having stricter pursuit policies. They could have strict pursuits policies that could have limited Border Patrol from doing these deadly pursuits and most likely saved multiple lives. But they don't, because they want to catch these immigrants who flee the border, because they don't want to be the ones who basically let immigrants or suspects escape. Again, that looks very bad for their agency. It doesn't mean what they're doing is right. It just means that is what they're thinking. That's their thought process, most likely. They get into very deadly pursuits. Again, this is especially Border Patrol. Border Patrol agents, they're often the ones criticized for many things that the CBP is criticized for. It is often Border Patrol who is criticized. Another thing that the CBP is commonly criticized for is linking to pursuits, failing to stop immigrants from, entering the U.S. They are very commonly criticized for that. Like I said, even in pursuits, if they choose not to endanger public safety and let the individual go, because they don't want to make the pursuit even more dangerous. And they'll very often be criticized for that. So they're often criticized for that, for immigrants getting to the U.S. As it is their core job to actually stop immigrants from fleeing the U.S. into the U.S. Again, ICE, they don't generally operate at borders on a day-to-day basis. They absolutely may, and they do sometimes, but on a day-to-day basis, they're more focused on immigrants who've gone to the U.S. illegally. They leave, immigration enforcement borders to Border Patrol and other CBP officers. But another thing that the CBP is commonly criticized for is their use of force. The CBP and especially Border Patrol is known for using excessive force in many situations. They'll, like I showed in the video earlier, they'll very often violate their agency's use of force policies and their department's use of force policies. And I know the CBP and the Department of Homeland Security, they very often back them. They act like they're supporting them. But let me tell you, they do still get in trouble. The agents involved with the use of force violations by the DHS. But the DHS, it wants to make its agency look good by defending them because they are a part of the DHS. So they'll very often do that. But aside from that, there are those are the main criticizations. Those are the main criticizations of the CBP. Those are the main ones. The CBP works with multiple law enforcement agencies from federal, state to local. I'm not going to get into the local and state law enforcement agencies they work with, as there are way too many of them. There are literally over 17 to 18,000 local and state law enforcement agencies in the U.S. So I'm just not going to get into those. But I will get into the main federal law enforcement agencies they work with. So the main federal law enforcement agencies they work with include number one, the U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE for short. The CBP and ICE very frequently work with each other. In fact, ICE is one of the most commonly seen law enforcement agencies working with the CBP, and that is essentially because their jurisdiction, first of all, very often overlaps. It very often overlaps because essentially their responsibilities are very, very similar. Again, while they are completely separate law enforcement agencies under the Department of Homeland Security, they function very, very similar. Both conduct immigration enforcement operations. Again, a lot of their focus is very similar. Again, some specific it's basically they'll work with ICE, whenever they have concurrent jurisdiction with them. So a specific example of a case where the CBP and ICE would most likely have concurrent jurisdiction is, again, this is hypothetically, an illegal immigrant flees the border and gets into the U.S. illegally. This illegal immigrant now is not just an ordinary illegal immigrant, but someone with a Homeland Security alert for being a potential terrorist. Now, while the CBP generally does not pursue individuals who have fled the border beyond a 100-mile zone, they will pursue individuals who have a threat to Homeland Security or have committed a crime against the CBP in some form of way. So in such a case, in this specific case, both ICE and the CBP would have concurrent jurisdiction. So you would most likely see USBP agents and HSI agents working together, and your RO officers, the whole gang working with each other to find, that illegal immigrant. As this is a great example. Sorry, this is a great example of a case where they would have concurrent jurisdiction. Another example, sorry, another example for which they would have most likely have concurrent jurisdiction in is if basically a immigrant fled the border and gone to the U.S. illegally, and is still within a 100 mile zone of that border for which they fled from. Then technically speaking, both ICE and the CBP would have concurrent jurisdiction over that. Now, whether they would actually work with each other over such a specific case is, in this kind of example where an immigrant flees the border, within a 100 miles zone of that border, that the legal immigrant will most likely flee that 100-mile zone before ICE even has the chance to show up. So, I mean, I'm just technically speaking on cases that they would have concurrent jurisdiction over. But yeah, the ICE and the CBP, they're basically best friends. They work with each other on a lot of things. So yeah. The CBP specifically, and most commonly its U.S. Border Patrol agents, are known to frequently work with the U.S. Coast Guard, particularly on, of course, cases it has concurrent jurisdiction over. So, for example, Marine Border Patrol agents, they will very often patrol seas that surround U.S. borders, U.S. land borders, as that is their main function. Marine Border Patrol agents. However, what will happen is they'll usually coordinate or run on the same radio frequency as the U.S. Coast Guard, who will alert them if, for example, an illegal immigrant is spotted or captured, that they very frequently work with. And it goes the same way. The CBP, Marine Border Patrol agents, they'll also, alert the Coast Guard if there is, for example, a sinking boat or a vehicle accident. They'll alert them first too, as there are these essentially set agreements between them. They very frequently work with each other to essentially ensure homeland security overall, as both agencies fall under the Department of Homeland Security. The CBP, to the lesser extent, also works with the U.S. Secret Service. Again, uncommonly, not generally, they work with the Secret Service, but they may work with them on cases like they may work with them when, for example, protecting important Homeland Security officials, such as the director of the CBP or the Secretary of Homeland Security. However, generally, DHS officials, aside from those from the CBP, are generally provided security solely from the U.S. Secret Service, or generally they don't receive security from the CBP. Only those DHS officials that are a part of the CBP will generally be protected by the CBP. More extent, they may work with the Secret Service on cases like, for example, an illegal immigrant is charged with credit card fraud. Then they will work much more commonly with the Secret Service. It is much more likely in such an event, such an event is much more likely that they will work with each other. They'll work with each other on essentially most frequently on investigative matters for which they have concurrent jurisdiction over. Now, while the CBP itself does not very frequently work with the Department of Homeland Security Office of Inspector General, as they are essentially an independent component of the DHS that basically reviews fraud, waste, misconduct, and corruption within the DHS, and furthermore aren't really always they're essentially the watchdogs of the CBP and other DHS components. And furthermore, they don't always get along with the CBP itself. However, DHS OIG special agents will very often work with CBP OPR investigators on investigating corruption within the CBP. But again, the CBP OPR, it's also an independent component of the CBP, so it's not really within the main or direct responsibilities of the CBP. So that's why it's not always bring up as a direct collaborating agency of the CBP. Just like the U.S. Coast Guard, the CBP will also work with with the NOAA Office of Law Enforcement. Except when it comes to the NOAA Office of Law Enforcement, they more focus on working with them over essentially enforcing federal commerce laws and federal laws regarding international treaties. But because again they have concurrent jurisdiction over enforcing international treaties and federal trade laws and commerce laws. That is something both the NOAA Office of Law Enforcement and the CBP have concurrent jurisdiction over. They generally work with each other when operating within a 100-mile zone of when operating within seas of 100 miles of a U.S. land border, because again, beyond that 100-mile zone, they generally don't maintain any responsibility necessarily, and it then belongs to the Coast Guard. But yeah, they'll work with them, they'll also work. The NOAA Office of Law Enforcement, its officers and special agents will also alert the CBP on any illegal immigrants found within those seas. Again, it goes both ways. So they do very frequently work with each other. The CBP will frequently work with the U.S. Department of Commerce Office of Export Enforcement over enforcing federal export and commerce related laws. So essentially, both have concurrent jurisdiction over federal laws regarding export. And so, for example, they have concurrent jurisdiction over basically, for example, if someone fails to, if someone who is if a shipment, if a company that is licensing, or if a company that is exporting through the automated export system fails to provide or fails to confess their automated export information to the Bureau of the Census or the U.S. munitions list. Again, depending on the specific item, they will most likely the CBP and the Office of Export Enforcement will have concurrent jurisdiction over that matter. So whether they do work with each other or not over that, they will still have concurrent jurisdiction over that. So again, they have worked with each other in the past, but it's especially on large cases, like, for example, there is an immediate threat to U.S. commerce, that they will very frequently work with the Office of Export Enforcement over. That's pretty much it for the collaboration with the Office of Export Enforcement. The CBP, specifically and most especially, its agricultural specialists from the Office of Field Operations will very frequently work with USDA animal and plant health inspectors from the USDA's Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service over essentially, finding, stopping, and halting imported goods that could threaten U.S. agriculture. So this includes things like pesticides. So this would include, fungicides, insecticides, rodenticides, etc., and invasive rodents and animals. So essentially any good imported into the U.S. that could cause disease or illness or infection or something to affect American agriculture, they will work with each other on. They will especially work with each other on serious cases that threaten both commerce and homeland security, such as agroterrorism and bioterrorism, for which they have concurrent jurisdiction over. For which they have concurrent jurisdiction over in specific cases. So they'll very frequently work with them. The CBP frequently works with the FBI, particularly on cases like those involving or regarding federal crimes regarding public corruption, terrorism, the killing of a federal agent, threats towards federal agents, organized crimes, white-collar crimes, economic crimes, essentially any crime for which the FBI has jurisdiction over and the CBP has jurisdiction over. And again, in order for the CBP to have jurisdiction over the crimes I just mentioned, it would have to be more specific, like a immigrant has committed one of those crimes. Specific examples of cases for which the FBI and the CBP would have concurrent jurisdiction over include, for example, if someone threatens a CBP officer, in such a case, both the FBI and the CBP would have concurrent jurisdiction. As the FBI, it, for one, has jurisdiction over threats towards any federal agent or officer. The CBP, it obviously has jurisdiction over threats towards its own officers and agents. So, and again, this is actually very likely. This kind of scenario is very likely and has happened in the past, as the CBP, its officers, as I mentioned early in the video, are one of the most commonly threatened law enforcement officers in the U.S. So this kind of scenario is very likely to happen, and has happened. But another example of a case for which they would have concurrent jurisdiction over is finding an illegal immigrant who has committed a crime against a CBP officer, like murder, and has essentially homeland security, or has homeland security alerts for being a potential terrorist. Again, any of those would work. They will work with each other on such a case to find that illegal immigrant, so they can be seen carrying out arrests together. Generally, they'll work in much broader task forces, not just in duos, but in task forces involving multiple agencies like ICE, themselves, the CBP and the FBI, of course, and the DEA, the ATF. Again, their task forces generally involve multiple agencies, not just them too. That's pretty much it for the collaboration for the CBP's collaboration with the FBI. the CBP will work with the DEA over essentially federal crimes, federal drug crimes taken by illegal immigrants. Taken by illegal immigrants. They will have concurrent jurisdiction over that. They can essentially. So, for example, they'll work with the DEA on finding illegal immigrants who have fled the border and have smuggled federally regulated drugs. So, narcotics. Those who smuggle narcotics across the border and are illegal immigrants are within the concurrent jurisdiction of the DEA and the CBP. So they'll very frequently work with each other on that. The mission of the focus of the CBP in such an investigation, in which the CBP and the DEA are trying to find an illegal immigrant who has smuggled federal narcotics across the border. The CBP's focus would be more so to actually find that illegal immigrant and arrest them. I mean, of course, also to seize the drugs as they are required to, but also. That's really the CBP's focus. The DEA's focus is more on just finding the drugs. That's their focus. They're not really focused on really finding the illegal immigrants. That's the CBP's role. They're focused on seizing those illegal drugs. And in such a case that both basically have found the illegal immigrant who has smuggled those drugs and are supposed to seize those drugs, generally the DEA will seize them as because again, both the CBP and the DEA are required to seize controlled substances, but the DEA has primary jurisdiction, so they would generally be the ones seizing it. So that's pretty much it for the CBP's collaboration with the DEA. The CBP will work with the ATF, particularly on cases such as, for example, example number 1, an illegal immigrant has illegally smuggled federally regulated alcohol or liquor, alcoholic beverages, tobacco, firearms, or explosives through a U.S. land border. In such a case, they would have concurrent jurisdiction over that. And in such a case, the CBP's focus would be to find those illegal immigrants and arrest them. And it would also be to, of course, find the goods that have been imported illegally. But then the ATF's focus in such a case would be more on just finding the illegal goods themselves, as they do not really have an obligation to find the illegal immigrants. That is not within their responsibility. That is within the responsibility of the CBP, rather. But another example of a case for which they would have concurrent jurisdiction over is if an illegal immigrant who has entered the U.S. illegally has essentially committed arson on multiple buildings and is considered a threat towards homeland security. Then the ATF and the CBP will have concurrent jurisdiction over that. In fact, in such a case, the FBI would most likely also get involved, as it's considered a threat towards national security. Those are just some core main examples. There are also other cases for which they will work with each other and have concurrent jurisdiction. Those are just the main examples. The CBP will work with the U.S. Marshal Service, particularly on apprehending violent suspects, for which both have concurrent jurisdiction over. So, for example, if a gang member has threatened a CBP officer, then both the U.S. Marshal Service and the CBP will most likely get involved. As basically threatening a federal officer, that is considered violent, and especially if they are also armed or something, which gang members are usually are, then they will most indefinitely get involved. But yeah, that's just the example. There are multiple other examples of cases they would get involved. The CBP utilizes many federal prisons operated by the Federal Bureau of Prisons, particularly when basically holding or housing inmates who have, or suspects who have committed a very serious felony level federal crime. So that, yeah, that they would be. That they would, be put in most likely in a Federal Bureau of Prisons prison for, as essentially suspects, individuals who have committed very, very serious federal crimes. They are generally not put in CBP correctional facilities as, like I mentioned earlier, or I think I mentioned earlier, housing felony level inmates with regular inmates just causes trouble. It poses a threat to the regular inmates, and threatens their lives. So generally they're supposed to put them in Federal Bureau of Prisons for higher security. The CBP will work with the U.S. Naval Criminal Investigative Service, or NCIS, particularly over, protecting, or the NCIS and the CBP. They'll work with each other when essentially they're trying to protect Marines and Navy sailors who are basically conducting operations along the border. As essentially the NCIS's role in that is to protect the military servicemen, while the CBP's role is more so to protect the border, and just ensure the operations aren't interfered with, immigration with illegal immigration or others. Yeah, that's that there are the NCIS is one of the many federal military investigative services or agencies for which the CBP works with. The CBP will work with the U.S. Air Force Office of Special Investigations, or USAF OSI for short, particularly similar to their collaboration with NCIS, on essentially cases where they are trying to protect Air Force officers. I don't study the military. Air Force. I'm just going to say Air Force officers for now. Yeah, they'll work with them over protecting those Air Force officers, and essentially, that's really what they'll work with each other on. Again, also some Air Force officers who have committed, crimes within a U.S. land border or port of entry, or against the CBP, they will also have work with each other over investigating. But yeah, I mean, those are really the main cases. The CBP will work with the Environmental Protection Agency, Office of Criminal Investigations, over essentially investigating federal environmental crimes that have, been taken by, for example, illegal immigrants, or have been taken within a U.S. land border or port of entry, they will have concurrent jurisdiction over that. They'll especially work with each other, similar to what I said earlier about APHIS. APHIS's collaboration with the CBP. They'll especially work with each other over serious homeland security threats like eco-terrorism and things that could, also threaten commerce and agriculture and just homeland security in general. They will especially work with each other on. The CBP will work with the IRS CIT over essentially finding illegal immigrants who have essentially either fled the border, a U.S. land border, or have committed a crime against a CBP officer, or have committed some sort of threat towards national or homeland security, or have some sort of immediate threat towards homeland security. They'll work with each other on essentially finding and arresting illegal immigrants who fail to pay taxes or who are charged with federal tax and finance related crimes. And this is very common, as of course illegal immigrants, they cannot really pay their taxes. So this kind of case is very common for each other to work on. The CBP will work with the BIA, OJS on things like, for example, investigating crimes taken along the border. While this is the CBP mainly within the responsibility of the CBP, parts of the border where there are Indian reservations near, then the BIA, OJS will have some sort of presence, as they are responsible for protecting those Indian reservations. So they do work with each other on such cases. But in such cases, the BIA OJS's main focus is on protecting those reservations, while the CBP's focus is more on apprehending illegal immigrants and protecting the border itself. So, yeah. The main differences when it comes to the main differences between the CBP and ICE are that number one, their responsibilities. The CBP it is responsible for managing. It is responsible for facilitating and managing immigration at U.S. ports of entry, while ICE is responsible for finding, arresting, and deporting immigrants who have fled U.S. ports of entry or have entered the U.S. illegally. In more simple terms, the CBP, it is responsible for enforcing immigration laws, federal immigration laws on those who are entering the U.S., while ICE is responsible for enforcing federal immigration laws on those who've already entered the U.S. Although, with that being said, ICE can also enforce federal immigration laws on those entering the U.S. Again, the main difference is that this CBP, it sticks to ports of entry and enforces federal immigration laws at ports of entry, while ICE enforces it nationwide. Which gets me to its jurisdiction. Although, with that being said, I want to cover their function first. The CBP, it's a uniformed agency, while ICE is an investigative agency. That's another important difference between the two. But in terms of jurisdiction, the CBP on one hand, Yeah, that they sorry, I'm spaced out there. The CBP, they while both have nationwide jurisdiction, now that sorry, I was rethinking about it. Uh, while both conduct operations nationwide, the ICE it is more prone to conducting operations nationwide, or in other words, ICE, as an investigative agency, it has primary responsibility nationwide. It is responsible for finding and apprehending illegal immigrants nationwide. The CBP maintains only maintains responsibility within U.S. ports of entry and borders. It does not really maintain responsibility outside there. So that is another very key difference. Again, while both have nationwide jurisdiction, the CBP it is more restricted to ports of entry than ICE is in more simple terms. The main difference between the CBP and TSA is that number one, the CBP, unlike TSA, is a law enforcement agency, while TSA is not a law enforcement agency and does not maintain any law enforcement authority in and of itself. The other difference is that, so number two, the CBP, unlike TSA, operates at land borders. TSA does not operate at land borders, only at airports and certain other ports of entry. But and then the number three, the other main difference is that is within their responsibility. So number three, the CBP on one hand, they are responsible for finding. They are responsible for protecting. They're responsible for enforcing federal immigration, customs, and customs laws at U.S. ports of entry. While TSA, it is responsible for protecting and screening individuals at U.S. ports of entry. While the CBP does protect and screen individuals at U.S. ports of entry, it is more focused on the enforcement of federal immigration laws. TSA is more focused on transportation security. So if there is, like, for example, if both the CBP Office of Field Operations and TSA both work at airports, TSA they will more handle, so if there's someone with who goes through a security checkpoint with a knife, the CBP Office of Field Operations, or a gun even, the CBP Office of Field Operations will most likely not handle that. It will most likely fall under the authority of TSA as like hazardous materials that go through screening checkpoints at airports. That's within TSA's authority, not the CBP Office of Field Operations, as it does not regard immigration. It does not, unless the individual who brought the knife or whatever hazardous material through that checkpoint is a illegal immigrant, they will most likely not handle it. They'll just leave it to TSA. Unless that individual is, for example, like about to carry out a terrorist attack or something that threatens homeland security, they will most likely leave it to TSA, as it is within their authority, not the CBP's. So that's the main difference between the CBP and TSA. All right. So when it comes to this photo, the main thing that I find hilarious about it is that essentially the local cops in the background are just standing there watching the border patrol agent being harassed by the rioters. And the main reason for that is that they're not really doing anything. Is most likely because of it's most likely because they don't really want to help them. Border Patrol, they conduct many operations in cities like LA, and yet I mean they never alert local law enforcement. They don't all they sometimes do good with local law enforcement, but not always. And they just the again, especially in a sanctuary city like LA, they're not really obligated to help Border Patrol at all. While they are technically supposed to take action when someone's being harassed, again, they it's pretty funny to them most likely because again, Border Patrol it's been conducting these recent mass deportations along with ICE and immigration raids, and what they're probably thinking is you asked for this Border Patrol because essentially that is what they've been doing. And as you can notice, most of the people here are just targeting the Border Patrol car, not really the local cops. And that's because they're annoyed at Border Patrol, not really the local cops. And that's because, of course, again, Border Patrol and ICE, they're the ones generally doing most of the immigration enforcement operations. Yeah, so, I mean, that's pretty much it for my analysis of this photo. U.S. Border Patrol agents are some of the most commonly threatened law enforcement officers in the U.S. In fact, approximately 7,000 U.S. Border Patrol agents have received some sort of threat since 2006. Many of these threats, especially the violent ones, come from Mexican drug cartels. Now, sometimes these drug cartels will hunt down these Border Patrol agents on their own, but more often they'll send their affiliated U.S. street gangs to do their dirty work for them. Now, these street gangs, they are part of the Mexican drug cartel's greater spotter networks, which are essentially networks used to find kidnap, and kill individuals with bounties. They're used for gaining information, and essentially the reason why Mexican drug cartels work with street gangs instead of hunting them by themselves is because it takes much longer and is much harder for a Mexican drug cartel to get into the U.S. and kill the Border Patrol agent on their own, rather than just, collaborating with a street gang in the U.S. and asking for them to do the dirty work. So that's pretty much why. Again, these street gangs and these street gangs, they will, such as the Latin Kings, they will generally carry out their ambushes against Border Patrol agents during Border Patrol immigration enforcement operations, arrests, and pretty much any major operation by Border Patrol where the Border Patrol has a heavy presence. They will do that then, but they will also very often do it when like a Border Patrol agent is alone. Sorry. They will, for example, if a Border Patrol agent is patrolling a very lonely road in the middle of nowhere, that is a very likely spot where, especially if the especially if the road is along the border, that is a very likely spot for them to be ambushed, for the Border Patrol agent to be ambushed, because again, it's a deserted area, and it's very easy for them to do that. They put bounties on these Border Patrol agents, they have members of the actual drug cartels and members of their affiliated street gangs, carrying out the bounties. Additionally, U.S. Border Patrol agents have also got into firefights or shootouts along the U.S. and Mexican border when they were fired at from the Mexican side, most often and most likely from cartels. That's pretty much it for threats against Border Patrol.